open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46.56 degrees.
Good evening. My name is Bill Yarber, and I'm the Senior Director of the Rural Center for AIDS STD Prevention, and also a Professor of Applied Health Science in the School of Public Health. Next to me is my dear and respected colleague, Dr. Carolyn Calloway Thomas, who is Professor and Chair in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies. The Rural Center for AIDS STD Prevention and the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies are sponsoring this event tonight in honor of Black History Month. Carolyn and I welcome you to the showing of Miss EVERS Boys. Both of us have a few comments before we see the movie. After the film, then we'll have a moment of silence and then a panel discussion. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is possibly the most enduring wound in American health science. In 1932, in Macon County, Alabama, the United States Public Health Service, with assistance of the Tuskegee Institute, a prestigious Black college, recruited 600 African American men to participate in an experiment involving the effects of untreated syphilis on Blacks. Of this group, 399 men had been diagnosed with syphilis, and 200 men in the study were controls. These men, for the most part, were sharecroppers from one of the poorest counties in Alabama. They were never told they had syphilis, but instead were informed they had bad blood. If measured by common sense, these men would be considered brilliant. Pleased with the prospect of free medical care, almost none of them had ever been to a doctor before. These trusting men became pawns of the federal government. Originally, the study was designed to last 6 to 9 months, but to satisfy scientific curiosity, it continued for 40 years, 1932 to 1972. The purpose of the study was to determine if there were racial differences in the developmental course of syphilis. Even after 1951, in which penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis, the Public Health Service refused to treat the Tuskegee men on the grounds that the experiment was a never again to be repeated opportunity. The participants were not told that their disease was sexually transmitted, nor were they informed it could be passed from mother to fetus. It was not until 1966 that anyone from the public health system expressed a moral concern over the study. Finally, whistleblowers brought to an end this incredibly unethical study in 1972. From a class action lawsuit, the United States government in 1974 reached an out-of-the-court settlement promising a monetary payment, lifetime medical benefits, and burial services for all living participants. In 1975, wives, widows, and offspring were added to the program, and in 1995, the program was expanded to include health as well as medical benefits. On May the 16th, 1997, President Bill Clinton apologized on behalf of the nation. The racial prejudice that created the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the cynicism that fueled it, and the callousness that allowed it to continue is difficult to fathom today. Yet the repercussions still reverberate today through African American communities.
Thank you, and I'd also like to welcome you this evening. In one of the most moving passages in Toni Morrison's novel, Song of Solomon, as her male characters talk sermonically about their dreams that they believe can be realized, and as the characters gun their memories while discussing the good times and hard times, things that changed and things that remained the same, the men paused upon an evocative spot of ground that Macon Dead had cultivated. In Morrison's words, it was a spot of ground that colored the characters' lives like a paintbrush and spoke to them as a sermon. The exquisite, beautiful farm with peach trees, clever irrigation systems, among other things, spoke compellingly as the characters gazed admiringly upon it and said, "Here, this here is what a man can do if he puts his mind to it and his back in it." You see, Macon Dead's farm exhorted the other characters in Morrison's novel to build something, to multiply things, to plow, to seed, to reap, to take advantage, to pass things on. As we celebrate Black History Month in 2017, let us all here this evening remember the glorious things that African Americans have passed on and are still passing on, including the 1772 Liberty and Peace poems penned so magnificently by Phyllis Wheatley, a young African girl, scarcely 18 years old, such that 18 of Boston's most notable men simply could not believe that such robust and creative ideas could have come from the mind of a Black woman. So the notable 18 august citizens of Boston called for an attestation. They needed evidence that Phyllis Wheatley's mind was indeed prodigious and boundless. Let us also remember Venerable Frederick Douglass, a great thinker with invaluable insights, who did so much to promote and advance the freedom of African American slaves, leaving an extraordinary intellectual record behind. Let us also remember the hidden figures. 3 Black women who used their mathematical genius, calculating by hand complex equations in the service of humankind, ensuring that space heroes like Neil Armstrong, Alan Shepard, and John Glenn could touch the moon, move around in outer space, and come home to Earth safely again. Yes, African Americans have a lovely history, but it is also troubled by unlovely, wretched, twisted, emblematic events that are signified by the work of Dr. J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, who performed medical vaginal surgeries on African American slaves without anesthesia, because he believed that Black slave women could tolerate excruciatingly intense pain and anguish. But the same man, Dr. J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, was kinder and gentler to upper-class white women, whom he believed needed ether in order to tolerate pain. So genteel and precious were their lives. So he spared them pain. Oh, the unbearable lightness of being. Today in 2017, we are also troubled by the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, a poor, struggling tobacco farmer in the hinterlands of America, whose cells were taken without her knowledge in 1951. According to author Rebecca Skloot, the same stolen but not lost cells became some of the most important tools in medicine. The cells that were taken from Henrietta Lacks without her knowledge have been instrumental in developing the polio vaccine, cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, and more. How shall we render this stolen but useful cell contribution to humanity? Let us ponder. Let us ponder and think about the dark, dark history of medical experimentation on African American people, even as we celebrate their remarkable achievements, the good that African Americans have done here upon this beautiful, bountiful earth. Africans have a lovely saying which has been popularized by Hillary Clinton, and it is that it takes a village, an expression that signifies the common good, the good we share in common in order to get the work of civic culture done beautifully. Tonight, our collective village is comprised of several acclaimed scholars and professors with lots of knowledge and expertise ranging from critical studies to memory and trauma to health and medical sociology. They will help us grapple the impact of the film, Miss Evers' Boys, a significant movie that you have seen tonight. In the interest of time, so we may utilize their powerful minds, and so you, members of the audience, might be advantaged, I shall by necessity not mention all there is to note about our esteemed panelists. May I invite you to Google their bios, but after the program, please. Let us welcome our panelists. Dr. Maria E. Hamilton Abegunde is director of the Graduate Mentoring Center and a postdoctoral fellow in the University Graduate School here at Indiana University. She is also a visiting scholar in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies and a keen poet. Her astute scholarly research centers on memory and trauma, grieving and ritual, and embodied memory. Crucially, she is an ancestral priest in the Yoruba Orisha tradition and a Rika master with a focus on the recovery and healing of ancestry memory from the earth and human body. She understands well the links between ancestral wounding, violence, and illness and disease. I'm also proud to proclaim that Dr. Abegunde was the first person to receive a doctoral degree in African American and African Diaspora Studies from Indiana University. May we welcome Dr. Abegunde. Associate Chair of Instruction and Undergraduate Studies, Dr. Rasul A. Mowatt's research. His interests are social justice, cultural studies, racial identity, and social inequality. Since earning a doctoral degree from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, he has received numerous research and teaching awards, from the Academy of Leisure Sciences Excellence and Teaching Award to the Trustees Teaching Award at Indiana University. His list of publications on topics such as making diversity tangible to lynching as leisure in the American behavioral scientists to the king of the damned, reading lynching as leisure, is long and impressive. Among the courses that he teaches is the popular, The Historical Significance of Race. Please greet Rasul Mowatt. We also have with us this evening esteemed Associate Professor of Creative Writing, Walton Muyumba, who is also Assistant Director of Creative Writing at Indiana University. He is a laudable poet with a sharp understanding of arts criticism, Black Atlantic studies, and cultural studies. His impressive scholarship has appeared in the Cambridge History of American Poetry, College Literature, and the Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisational Studies. He is also building projects on John Edgar Wiedeman's literary works and about ethnic American art in the age of terrorism. Professor Muyumba publishes frequently in The Atlantic, the Chicago Tribune, The Crisis, the New York Times, and the New Republic, among other outlets. Please give a round of applause for him as well. Our last, but certainly not least, panelist is Dr. Bernice A. Pescosolido, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health Services Research. Since receiving her PhD degree from Yale University, she has focused her outstanding research and teaching on social issues in health, illness, and healing. Her research provides an outstanding understanding of the wires through which people's attitudes and actions are influenced. In the area of stigma research, Dr. Pescosolido initiated the first major national study of stigma of mental illness in the United States over 40 years. Last year, I'm pleased to announce that she was inducted into the prestigious National Academy of Medicine. We are especially grateful to Dr. Pescosolido for interrupting her sabbatical leave in order to join us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome enthusiastically our panelists. Thank you. I believe I have the first opportunity to query this august panel. I want to know, what are the repercussions from the Tuskegee Experiment that still reverberate today? Bernice, you look as though you're ready.
I'm ready. I did my homework. Well, it's, one of the things that I think is really important is how much of our understanding of things like the Tuskegee Experiment and its repercussions are sort of based on myth. And so we were very curious about this, and it came from the work I was doing on stigma, and everybody always told me that African Americans were this way or that way about mental health issues, and they believe this or that, or they don't go for health care, it's because of Tuskegee. And I didn't have a clue, so I called a colleague of mine who is at University of Michigan, now at Harvard, David R. Williams. If you don't know his work, you really need to look at it. He was the premier scholar who showed. He believed that the inequality or disparities in health among racial groups in America was due in part to discrimination and the effects of discrimination on the body and the soul and the mind. And people told him at the NIH, you'll never, that's how can that be, number one? And number two, even if it's true, you'll never be able to find it. Well, he ignored them, and he developed some very important instrumentation on discrimination, and he has been able to prove it. So when I was wondering about African Americans, I called David, and I said, what do we know about Black mental health in America? Probably not the right way to say it, but I was like, David, what do we really know about African Americans? And his answer was, not a whole heck of a lot. We make assumptions. And so one of the things that we did in our national studies is we looked at what was different between African Americans and Caucasians in the US, because other groups, this is a nationally representative study, so other groups really are not represented in a way that you can look at, but you can do the essentially the black-white comparison. And what we found is that African Americans aren't different, except on two crucial things. One, which is a direct ramification of the Tuskegee experiments, which is any differences in belief about health and healthcare are not there. But there is a crucial difference in the willingness to participate in medical research because of the lack of trust. That is a direct legacy of the Tuskegee experiment. And the second, which I think is also grounded in reality and history, is the unwillingness to take psychiatric medications, which no Americans want to take. As I always say, they want you to take them, but they don't want to take them. But African Americans are even more unwilling to take them because of their concern about why they're being given psychiatric medication. So there's a lot more complexity to inequality in America than the kinds of things, stark differences that we hear. And so I think that's really important to understand and to study and provide data for what is a real difference and where aren't the differences. But certainly the Tuskegee effect shows up.
We can go in order, or we can be spontaneous.
I guess we'll go in order then. I was trying to do my best to look, and nobody would take the cue. So I guess to follow up, some additional things that we could sort of think about in terms of repercussions. One that I think is really important and striking to sort of mention very quickly is just the idea of another person being human, right? When we view a person who comes in for care, of any type, do we see that person as human? And one of the things that's clearly clear from the Tuskegee experiment is that not all people were considered in that way. So if this person was inhuman, then they could be not only treated or not treated in a certain way, but also we could perceive of their abilities to do certain things in a very unnatural way. So one of the things that we still see in terms of race is this sort of treatment of one population being inhuman and the other one being very much human. So we see the whole idea, especially in terms of implicit bias, in terms of treatment of pain medicine. When people go in, people have a perception as if people who are black have a higher pain threshold. We can tolerate pain without any sort of anesthesia and so on. And so that is one lasting repercussions that there are clearly some people when they go in for health or for medication, they are not viewed as human. The second is a myth that somehow science is supreme, meaning that science is sort of free of bias and all these unethical things. No, we actually have this. We see it over and over again that science is very much unethical. Because one of the things that is important to mention while the Tuskegee experiment was going on, when you get into the 1940s for a 2-year period, the United States government was also committing another syphilis experiment in Guatemala, right, where 700 people were given syphilis. They did not have syphilis, they were given syphilis. So while these experiences were going on at Tuskegee, you had this particular study that was also occurring, and I'll probably get back to that to give you some more context of what occurred in Guatemala. So war in science is not supreme, but we still hold on to that as if there are other things that are free of bias, but science doesn't have that bias. The third is because science and research become so supreme, the idea is that we are all driven by this need, and there's several of us as colleagues in here. We're driven oftentimes by funding, and so then funding all of a sudden may change our ethical values. One of the things that's not really brought about in this particular Miss Evers Boys film is the fact that that Tuskegee was in dire straits of funding. Rosenwald, who was the owner of Sears Roebuck Company, their foundation pulled funding, and so they began to do their own studies around syphilis, holding back treatment just so they can attract funding, which is then how the U.S. government was able to sort of exploit that sort of mutual interest or mutual need. And so I'll try to return to that as well. But those are the 3 things that I would like to probably, at least begin with in terms of response to this particular question.
So I'm in total agreement with everything that was said before. I am curious, by a show of hands, for some people, who has seen this movie for the first time? Is there anyone?
Oh,
okay.
Wow.
All right. Okay. And who in the room, by a show of hands again, had not heard of this study prior to this? Okay. I'm asking that because I want to pick up on something in terms of current repercussions. One of the things, I'm going to speak from my particular area in terms of memory and trauma. And just to say that one of the repercussions that one can think about in terms of looking at a movie like this, right? If it's your first time seeing this movie, right? Separating out what is fact, what is movie, right? What in fact is, what are some stereotypes that are in this movie. So in thinking about the Tuskegee study, right, we can't separate the discussion of the Tuskegee study from the study of sexuality, particularly black male sexuality and promiscuity and syphilis itself, right? And so paying attention to how these things are repeated in the movie itself. What happens if you're seeing this movie for the first time, or if you're hearing about this for the first time, or an aspect of the study of the self in terms of repercussion, is the ways in which that black communities and African American communities and white communities create a particular type of cultural memory around it, right? How it is remembered, how it is in fact taught, how it is transmitted, right? The idea of how one responds to it, does not respond to a study, is very much connected to that, going back to those assumptions, going back to those myths, right? And where does a film like this, right? Because if we're going to talk about the public health and talk about the film being shown for a particular reason, how are those things reinforced in a movie like this itself, particularly given the playwright, the director, and all of the other production methods to it. So I'll just leave that there.
I'll pick up with this conception of narrative. Just by a show of hands, so I don't give anything away, how many people went to see Get Out this weekend? So I'll try and not spoil it.
Thank you.
But what's significant about thinking about memory and what this film, Get Out, is doing, Jordan Peele's film, is kind of reviving in the present tense the narrative of terrorization around black bodies, historically and also in the context of medicine. And the film turns on what I think is a kind of deep irony of especially American medical science and African Americans. It's the notion that the black body is both expendable and physically superior simultaneously. And the film really is about eugenics. And that is, I think, part of the narrative that is ongoing with sexuality and the ongoing history. And not to spoil the point, but this great book from 2006, Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, is a great history of American medical science and scientific experimentation on black bodies from the 17th century forward. So what this current film revives in relationship to what we just watched is carrying a narrative of the black body as useful for continuing experimentation, discovery about superhuman possibilities, but for the benefit of white folks, essentially, right? I think this is one of the things that the film turns on here, is that the science can be beautiful only if white bodies are spared.
Well, white male bodies, please.
White male bodies.
Right?
Exactly.
Because one of the things you notice about this film is that women had no part in it, and women had no part in most NIH research until the 1980s, when Bernadine Healy was the first female director of the National Institute of Health, and I was there when she said to researchers, "You must include women." And I can tell you that the response in the room was, they were just horrified that, that there were all things about women's bodies that was going to affect their science. And so we do have a sense of white male privilege, that is being, I think, in this film, because nobody cared about the black women that were dying of syphilis in this movie either.
Were you surprised by the involvement of the nurse, the black nurse, and the black doctor?
I went to college in the 90s, very much a political time period, and so many of us who were on the campus as student activists, we came in contact with bad blood in terms of a book, and we did not have a perception at all at that time that, one, where it was. We did not put it together, Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington, black institution. We were thinking, it was these white doctors that flew in from the government and just shot everybody up and then left, right? And so, and information, access to information was very limited. If you think about that time period, I know it's hard for you to think of that time period in that way, but it's not like you can easily search for things. We had to actually go into the stacks of libraries to review stuff, and so if you imagine if you're a sophomore, how likely you were to go into the stacks to look at a hearing report from the 1972 Senate hearing.
Unlike dot matrix printer with
Right.
that
So,
you had to wait as it printed out, ripped it and folded it up.
So it was very impressive just for the fact that we knew about the Tuskegee Experiment, but we did not know about the details. So your question is great, because I think that perception still lingers to today, that we do not see that it was very much a partnership between the staff of Tuskegee, so the black staff of Tuskegee and the United States government, very much so, because if you go and look at the pictures, you'll see this sort of partnership. Again, how the outreach occurred. Tuskegee is the one that had the credit and the clout amongst all of the residents of the area. Without that clout, nobody would have ever come forward. And so, yes, then I had no idea, and then once I began to sort of know, and of course more information is now more readily available, the shock moves to now having a better understanding of how these things play out So it's never this sort of mysterious, invisible enemy that comes in. It is the fact that still that we are all driven by this aspiration. When we think about black bodies being expendable, it's any of us who perceives it as expendable, which is at the heart of course, one of the hashtags that we all know, which is Black Lives Matter, right? The idea that a black life does not matter and we need that reinforcement, but all of us need that particular reinforcement.
I was struck in a movie about this tension or conflict between not treatment, but yet trying to show that there's no difference among black and white in the developmental course of syphilis. And I'd just like to hear your reactions to that. I mean, do you believe in the sincerity of the federal government in saying that, or was it justification to do this experiment? So what are some of your reactions to that conflict between those?
To pick up on something that Rasul's working out there, I mean, I'll come back to narrative because this is the thing I'm thinking about all the time. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, even though it's not about this experiment, is taking place on a campus that is not dissimilar from Tuskegee, where Ellison was an undergraduate. And there's a dean who has a lot of power, Dean Bledsoe, and Bledsoe lays out a claim that I think is played out by the doctor's realization and then participation, which is that he's got to defend the institution and in that defense prove that Negroes are human. And if he has to expend some bodies in order to prove that point, he's willing to do that because the institution has to survive because it is a beacon. It's the shining light on the hill, meant to represent not only the humanity of black folk but future possibility. So you get entangled, and you're willing to take anyone out who is going to disrupt access to monies that will protect the institution. This is something that Ellison comes back to again and again in his novel Invisible Man. And it might be, at least from his perspective, the kind of crucial entanglement that any striving African American is going to face, where they get resources from and what the cost of those resources are going to be. So even though it seems like it's a moral problem, not defending the institution is also a moral problem.
If I can jump in
Sure.
real quickly. So, I mean, I think combining both your questions too, I think an important point is just to bring up in terms of timeline. 1962, at this particular point in time, about 127 black doctors were rotated through this study. So this study became a training ground, right? So for doctors, and it was through that rotation of 127 doctors, finally one or two began to raise ethical questions and then leaked information out to a journalist who then in 1972 writes an article that exposes all of it, which then leads to the Senate hearing that we see dramatized on screen here. So the idea that this study ran for all this particular time and the ethics really doesn't come up until a fresh face comes into the room, but it's also a training ground for black doctors. Right. Jumping back forward, so 1932 is when funding in the program begins, but they were already starting to publish papers between 1934 and 1936 based on the study, but not in the context of publishing around the actual theme that they were portraying in the movie of the issues or differences of syphilis amongst the Negro race. That was not the title of the publication. It was just simply publications around syphilis and how it began to be seen in the various phases.
I think that I'd like to sort of bring up, I mean, one of the things I like about this film is that it's not judgmental in the sense that it's like, oh, it's, I mean, you know, everybody thinks, well, it's so obvious now. But we all know hindsight is 20/20, and maybe when penicillin was invented and they didn't give it, that was obvious. But what I like about the movie is the whole question of the study from the beginning. And quite frankly, all of medical research is subject to these kind of ethical questions. I mean, the standard model in our country right now is that, you know, we have a control group, you know, we have double-blind studies, right? That's the golden, you know, that's the gold standard. So, you know, half of the people are not getting any treatment at all. And, you know, that's the way we think that science should be done. And I think we have to ask, at what point do you feel that what happened at Tuskegee became unethical? You know, it wasn't just when they had penicillin, but, you know, those mercury rubs were probably killing those men. Right. I mean, mercury is deadly to the human body, you know, and I think we have to ask the question, you know, is our way of doing it better? And I think we have to put that in line with sort of larger American values, because if we look at, I think the best example is birth control. When birth control pills first came out, we did it as sort of an experiment. You know, there were women who took them and women who didn't. And what we found out was that the doses were so high that women were dying of blood clots, right? Well, that was our choice as Americans to do the study as a naturalistic study. What they did in China, which I think would seem offensive and unethical to us, is they took women in different villages, and these women got, again, rural villages, these women got the pill and these women didn't, right? And I think that would be morally offensive to us. But in fact, very many fewer women in China died in terms of the early years of the pill because of the way they did it. So we have to think about this question of, you know, the context in which those people made those decisions, and the sort of it's not only the historical time but the historical place of where these decisions were made. And I just came off of a 5-year stint of chairing a NIH panel, review panel, and we spend a great deal of time on the human subjects part. You know, hopefully you just can say, yes, it's scientifically justified, but when it isn't, we end up spending a lot of time on it when anybody has a question, because these questions are not obvious. It's not, you know, that things are, you know, they're on a spectrum, and at what point? So one of the things about the reimbursement for $50 at that point, that was a lot of money at that time. And this still happens today, because let's suppose that you want to study a low SES, you know, a lower income group. The line is, you know, at what point are you giving them, you know, a good reimbursement for their time, and at what point are you giving them so much money that it's coercive? As a sociologist, I find that to be a very bizarre question when you're talking about people in poverty. You know, so I don't think there's any answer to that, and I bet in 50 years we'll look back on what we did in terms of reimbursement methods and other ethical decisions and say, well, it's obvious that what they were doing was unethical. And so to me, the question of when things became unethical in the Tuskegee study was way before the invention of penicillin, but that was sort of the hard decision point.
I think we're running short of time. Do we have any time left for any questions or comments from the audience? Okay, sorry, because this is so rich, but we do want to save time for any comments or reactions from the audience.
So if you have a question or a comment, please stand and deliver.
Well, that's an order. Salute Carolyn when you stand.
Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julius Lee, and I'm a second-year graduate student in public health, School of Public Health. And my question is regarding your work with the NIH and Human Subjects Committee. Did you all consider the Belmont report after, and could you share with the audience the Belmont report regarding human subjects?
Any of you who are doing research on this campus have to do that module, and you know, and I dread it every time. I've been doing this for like years and years. I've been on so many. I was frozen for 7 years on the ethics committee of the American Sociological Association, and yet I fear this test. But the Belmont report is the foundation of all human subjects decision making. And it came, as a direct result, although it took a while, of Nazi experimentation during World War II. And it has 3 points. Beneficence. Is anybody going to help me out here?
Beneficence, assessment, appropriate guidelines, and informed consent.
Like informed consent, beneficence, and justice, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so those are the sort of the sort of complex values that the Belmont report is based on. And then, you have to then take it down to, more and more practicalities, for example. So, for example, I do a lot of work with people who have mental illness. And the old question was, which I always found offensive, was people would tell me all the time, you can't do research on people who are mentally ill because they're not competent. Well, that's an ignorant stereotype. But the question that continues is, at what point is somebody experiencing an episode that you have to sacrifice the research and go into emergency protocol? So those are the things, a lot of people don't think about that. What if you're interviewing somebody, and you're not doing mental illness, you're just doing something else, and either, what is it called, a mandatory reporting state?
Yes.
So if we're on the phone with somebody, if somebody's doing a telephone interview and the person you're interviewing, the baby's in the back crying, and you hear the baby, you hear the person say, hold on a minute, and they go and you hear them smack the baby, you have to report that. So we have certain rules that sort of come down from those 3 things. Protection of human subjects in general, and making sure that everybody has an equal probability of being selected. I still don't think that's the case. I don't think people have an equal probability of being selected, but I don't think it's ever going to be perfect, because I find ethics to be very complex, not an easy thing at all. And to me, it's always that line. Where are you going to draw that line? And that changes with time and with medical discoveries, and it changes with changes in American values. And so I think the Belmont report is really a good place to start, but I don't think it's the end, because it really is the sort of the general values. And where the rubber meets the road is when you're dealing with human subjects in your research, and you have to decide at what point the science is not as important as that person.
Thank you. I saw a hand in the back. We have time for one more question. Who is going to be the person? Well, would members of the panelists, would you like to say something else that we've not mentioned before? You have something that you'd like to say. You will not be the same unless you say it.
And we don't have much time. So.
I'll say something really quickly, just because I've just finished rereading this book that came out beginning of last year called White Rage, and it's a great overall book, but there's one point that I was rereading this morning that kind of stunned me in preparation for thinking about this film, that because of segregated classrooms, beginning specifically in the Deep South, but then spreading across the U.S., the effect of resistance to desegregating those classrooms has had the effect of not producing enough scientists of color. And because of that, there's the possibility that we continue running into problems with studying minorities. And I guess we ought to add also, in terms of gender, we don't produce enough women in the sciences. And so this is something I tell my classes all the time, that we're constantly fighting ourselves. We make choices for, we Americans make choices based on a particular kind of desire for ethnic purity. And because we do that, we affect over generations the possibility for living freer, better lives collectively.
I'd like to end with a question. So I would like to know whether or not there really was a Caleb and whether or not he ended up working in the region.
Carolyn, could you make a final comment?
Yes, I would like to thank all of you for coming this evening. And I was trying to think of one thing that I should say in light of the movie. And I finally summoned Seneca. Seneca wrote a treatise on anger. And he sent a lovely letter to his brother Novartis and said to his brother Novartis that he should not be angry. And he uttered words that I think I'd like to leave us with. Seneca said, "While we live, while we breathe, while we work among other human beings, let us cultivate humanity." So I leave you with the words of Seneca. Let us cultivate humanity. And once again, thank you so much for coming out. And let's thank our lovely panelists for their wonderful, wonderful contributions. Have a good evening.